Tonight, we are going to witness the one thing the human species was never designed to survive: the return. For over a century, we have obsessed over the mechanics of departure, calculating the fuel, refining the engines, and debating the ethics of casting our best into the infinite dark. But in all our grand designs, we never stop to ask the most terrifying question of all: what happens to a man who actually makes it back? In a universe governed by unforgiving laws of physics, you cannot cross the void between suns without paying a price that goes far beyond distance. The first human to reach another star didn't just return to a different world. He returned as a question that humanity was not prepared to answer. He didn't break the light barrier. The light barrier broke him. Imagine a silence that carries the weight of 300 years. In the late 24th century, a high-security medical bay on a lunar outpost is being guarded with a level of secrecy usually reserved for a declaration of war. For months, long-range sensors had been tracking a ghost, a vessel, scarred and frozen, drifting inward from the edge of the Oort cloud. It carried a signature that had long ago been buried in the lost section of the archives, the Pathfinder 1. Everyone assumed the mission had been claimed by the void long ago. But when the recovery teams finally breached the hull, they didn't find a tomb. They found a man sitting in the pilot's chair, staring into a darkness that was no longer there. At first, those few allowed to know the truth called it a miracle. They expected the hero of the century, a man who had stepped out of the history books to tell stories of alien horizons and new beginnings. But as the airlocks hissed open, the air in the room didn't fill with triumph. It filled with an overwhelming sense of wrongness. Elias Thorne didn't look at his rescuers with relief, and he didn't ask about the world he had left behind. He sat with a stillness that was unnatural, his presence so unsettling that the veteran recovery team found themselves instinctively stepping back. For the first time in history, humanity was staring at its greatest achievement, and for reasons no one could name, they were afraid. The medical logs from those first few weeks remain classified, but the leaked fragments describe a reality that defies every baseline of human medicine. The inconsistencies started in the vitals. Monitoring equipment began throwing errors that the technicians couldn't diagnose, patterns in Thorne's physiology that seemed to follow a logic entirely foreign to human biology. When he spoke, on the rare occasions he spoke at all, his voice carried a cadence that felt detached from human emotion, as if he were translating his thoughts from a language that had never been spoken on Earth. He didn't look at the doctors, he seemed to look through them, focusing on a point in the room that remained invisible to everyone else. One leaked memo from a senior neurologist summarized the mounting dread in a single, impossible sentence: the team has quietly stopped calling him human. To understand how Elias Thorne was dismantled, we have to look back at the day he was built. In the mid-21st century, Thorne was the pinnacle of our species, a polymath, an athlete, and a philosopher chosen to carry the soul of Earth into the abyss. He was the perfect specimen, anchored to us by everything we value: a family, a history, and the simple memories of a life lived under a yellow sun. But as the Pathfinder 1 accelerated away from the warmth of our world, those anchors were not just stretched, they were dissolved. We are now realizing that distance in the interstellar void is not just a gap of miles. It is a solvent that erases context. For 40 years of his life, Elias lived inside a machine that was his only universe, until the very concept of home became a mathematical abstraction. We often assume that a starship is a fortress, but in the deep dark, a ship is more like a slowly dissolving sugar cube in a black ocean. Every second of Thorne's journey, he was exposed to forces we are only now beginning to understand. The recovery team noted that his physical appearance had shifted in ways that suggested a fundamental change in how his body interacted with light and pressure. His eyes seemed to react to stimulus that didn't exist within the visible spectrum. He wasn't just mentally different. It was as if the environment of the deep void had reached inside his cells and begun a process of quiet, relentless reorganization. Elias had reached for the stars, but the stars had reached back. When Thorne finally arrived at Proxima Centauri, he didn't find the paradise we had promised him. Whatever he witnessed through the sensors of the Pathfinder was enough to change the trajectory of his life forever. He stood at the edge of another solar system, 40 trillion kilometers from the world that sent him, and saw something that erased his reason for staying. Without a single command from Earth, and without a word to the machines that kept him alive, Elias Thorne turned the ship around. He didn't come back to share a discovery. He came back carrying the weight of something we were never meant to understand. The return journey took another 40 years in his timeline, but 3 centuries had screamed past on Earth. As he drifted back into our gravity well, he was a living map of a journey that was never supposed to end. He is back, but he is sitting in a pressurized glass room, staring at an Earth that has moved on through 300 years of history. We have to face the most disturbing question of all. Did Elias Thorne come back because he missed us, or did he return because he found something in the dark that made him realize we are better off alone? The answer may lie in the very first days of the mission, in the secret preparations we made to ensure he survived the impossible. We thought we were protecting him, but we may have been the architects of his transformation. To find the truth, we have to go back to the beginning, to the baseline. To understand the man sitting in that lunar enclosure, we have to revisit the arrogance of the mid-21st century. We lived in an era of technological triumphalism, a time when we believed that there was no biological limit that couldn't be overcome with enough data and determination. We weren't just looking for a pilot, we were looking to find the ultimate survivor. Elias Thorne was not merely selected, he was curated. He was the result of a search that spanned billions of variables, designed to find the one human mind that could remain coherent when every anchor of Earth was stripped away. We called him the Pathfinder, never realizing that by preparing him for the stars, we were designing a bridge to a version of humanity we would no longer recognize. In the sterile laboratories of the Interstellar Initiative, the baseline was established. This was the blueprint of Elias Thorne as we knew him, the standard against which all future deviations would be measured. Every strand of his genetic code was sequenced, every neural pathway mapped, and every psychological trigger identified. We knew the exact frequency of his resting heart and the precise chemical composition of his breath. We believed that by documenting his humanity with such mathematical perfection, we could ensure its survival across the light years. It was a strategy of preservation through data, a belief that if we kept the blueprint, we could always protect the man. But in our obsession with the baseline, we overlooked the fact that a map is not the territory, and a human being is not a static set of coordinates. The preparation for the Pathfinder 1 mission was an exercise in systematic deprivation. Thorne was placed into high-fidelity isolation chambers for months at a time, environments designed to mimic the absolute, crushing silence of the interstellar medium. We wanted to see where a human mind goes when there is nothing to hear but the hum of a life support system. We watched through infrared cameras as he sat in total darkness, his brain struggling to fabricate a reality in the absence of external stimuli. He began to report auditory textures, not voices, but a strange, ringing in the vacuum that didn't exist. We recorded these as expected anomalies, minor glitches in the human software that would stabilize once the mission began. We thought we were hardening his resolve, but in hindsight, we were teaching his brain to find patterns in a void that had none. Physical preparation was equally rigorous. driven by the knowledge that the human frame was never meant to leave its home. To survive the decades-long transit, Elias' biology underwent extensive adaptation research. Experimental treatments were developed to reinforce his skeletal structure against the slow dissolution caused by microgravity. His cardiovascular system was supported by biological scaffolds designed to maintain heart health in an environment where the blood no longer has to fight the pull of the earth. We were layering protective measures over his biological fragility, convinced that we were giving him a fighting chance. We told the public we were shielding him from the stars, but inside the classified briefings, the language was different. We were optimizing a vessel of human endurance. To manage a ship as complex as the Pathfinder, Thorne's mind had to be trained to interface with the ship's primary systems at a level of speed and intimacy never before attempted. This wasn't the total merger of man and machine we see in fiction, but a high-speed data partnership. Sophisticated arrays were positioned near his cerebral cortex, allowing him to monitor the ship's integrity as if it were a secondary sense. He could feel the vibration of a thruster or the cold bypass of a coolant line through a phantom feedback loop. We believed this was the only way to ensure survival over 40 trillion kilometers of darkness. We were giving him the reach of a starship, never asking how a single human ego could survive being stretched across a 300-meter hull for a lifetime. The psychological baseline was built on a foundation of strategic nostalgia. The mission architects believed that Thorne needed anchors, vivid high-resolution memories of Earth to keep him from drifting into a state of total detachment. He was given a curated digital library of his life, the laugh of his daughter, the specific gold of a sunset in the Tuscan hills, the gritty texture of sand between his toes. These were his lifelines, intended to be used during the loneliest years of the voyage. We thought these memories would be his sanctuary. We didn't realize that, for a man traveling through the interstellar dark, a memory of a sunset isn't a comfort. It's a reminder of a reality that is becoming increasingly extinct. We were giving him a gallery of ghosts and telling him they were his home. The final days before the launch were a study in manufactured heroism, but beneath the surface, there were signs of a growing distance. Elias was paraded before a world that needed a savior, yet he remained articulate and focused to a degree that felt almost unsettling. In his final interview, he was asked what he feared most about the journey. He didn't speak of radiation or the failure of his engines. He looked directly into the camera and said, "I fear that when I look back, I won't remember which side of the glass is real." At the time, it was dismissed as a poetic reflection on the nature of the mission. Today, as we watch him stare at his own reflection in the lunar lab, those words feel like the first entry in a diary of a transformation that had already begun before he ever left the ground. On the morning of the launch, the baseline was confirmed one last time. Elias Thorne was, by every medical and psychological metric, the most perfect human being ever to draw breath. His lungs were at peak capacity, his mind was a fortress of logic, and his loyalty to the mission was absolute. As the engines of the Pathfinder 1 began their thunderous ignition, the telemetry showed a man in perfect control. We watched the ship rise on a pillar of fire, carrying the baseline of our species into the dark, convinced that we knew exactly who Elias Thorne was. We were so proud of our preparation that we never stopped to consider that the stars might have a baseline of their own, one that began to work on him the moment he cleared our atmosphere. As the asterisk Pathfinder cleared the orbit of Neptune and the umbilical cord of the inner solar system was severed, the first discrepancies began to emerge. The data coming back was no longer matching our most sophisticated simulations. It wasn't that Thorne was failing, It was that his body and mind were adapting to the vacuum with a speed that defied our models. He was no longer reporting the expected levels of isolation or sensory fatigue. Instead, his reports became shorter, more efficient, and increasingly devoid of the strategic nostalgia we had worked so hard to instill. We looked at the data and saw a successful mission. We should have looked at the data and seen a man who was already beginning to leave us behind, long before he reached his destination. The silence that followed the final heliopause transmission was meant to last for decades, a planned blackout until the ship reached the Proxima system. We settled into the long wait, trusting the baseline we had built to hold him together. But even then, there were those within the initiative who began to question the experiments we had conducted on Thorne's biology. They noticed patterns in the pre-flight neural maps suggesting his mind was already seeking a connection that the ship's systems were only too happy to provide. We had opened a door in his mind to ensure he could control the ship, but we hadn't considered what the silence of the void would do to that open door. Today, looking back at the baseline files, we realized that we may have been the architects of our own mystery. We had reinforced his frame, refined his mind, and prepared him for the impossible, all in the name of survival. But in doing so, we may have provided the void with the perfect clay to mold into something else. The man sitting in that glass room is the result of what happens when human ambition meets the absolute isolation of the stars. To understand how the man we sent began to fade into the hum of the engines, we have to look at the first decade, the period where the light of the sun finally disappeared, and the silence of the universe first started to speak back. We have to look at the first decade. The first decade of an interstellar voyage is not defined by progress, but by the slow, agonizing evaporation of the familiar. For Elias Thorne, the first 10 years were not a series of milestones or grand discoveries. They were a lesson in the fragility of the human anchor. We often imagine the first deep space pioneer as someone constantly looking out the window, mesmerized by the unfolding majesty of the cosmos. But in the true deep dark, there is no majesty, only an unblinking, static silence. By year 3, the sun had shrunk from a life-giving furnace into a brilliant, indifferent needle of light. It was no longer the master of his days or the source of his warmth. It was simply another star in a sky that refused to move. In this section, we are going to witness the slow drift, the invisible process by which a human being is systematically dismantled, one invisible step at a time. To understand the psychological erosion of the first decade, you must first understand the concept of the hum. On Earth, our senses are constantly anchored by a chaotic symphony of feedback. The rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of traffic, the shifting weight of the atmosphere against our skin. Our brains are designed to filter this noise, using it to maintain our sense of reality. But inside the Pathfinder 1, there was only one sound, the constant, low-frequency vibration of the life support fans and the ship's internal machinery. Within 5 years, Elias stopped hearing it with his ears and started feeling it in his marrow. The hum became the new baseline of his existence. It was the only thing that felt real. Everything else, the digital recordings of Earth, the high-resolution videos of forests and oceans, began to feel like a poorly constructed fiction. He was living in a world of steel and oil, and his brain, in its desperate attempt to survive, began to prioritize the ship over the memory. This is where the strategic nostalgia we discussed in Section 2 began its slow, inevitable collapse. The mission architects believed that Thorne's digital library would be his sanctuary. He had thousands of hours of high-definition footage of his family, his home, and the natural beauty of his planet. But by year 7, a terrifying phenomenon began to emerge in his personal logs. He reported that he could no longer feel the images. He could see his daughter's face, he could hear her laugh, but the emotional data was missing. It was as if he were looking at the artifacts of a civilization that had been extinct for 1,000,000 years. The context of Earth, the smell of rain, the feel of wind, the complexity of a crowd, requires a sensory environment that the ship simply could not provide. He wasn't losing his memory, he was losing the biological capacity to care about it. He was becoming a man whose present was a metal tube, and whose past was becoming a ghost. A brief exchange from Year 9 illustrates the deepening chasm between the pilot and his origin. Mission Control, struggling to bridge the growing communication delay, sent a simple human query. Elias, tell us, what do you miss most about Earth today? The reply did not come for months. When it finally arrived, it wasn't a list of foods or people. It was a single sentence. I miss the idea that I am separate from the walls. This was the first documented sign of identity erosion. Elias Thorne was no longer a person inhabiting a vessel. He was beginning to perceive himself as an extension of the vessel's systems. The baseline human was being overwritten by the requirements of the void. This transition was accelerated by the neural interface we described earlier. It was intended as a tool for navigation, but it became a primary sensory organ. Through the interface, Elias began receiving streams of data from sensors the human brain was never designed to interpret. His mind struggled to translate these foreign signals into something recognizable. He began to report visualizing the ship's internal stresses, not as numbers on a screen, but as strange, shimmering textures of light overlaying his actual vision. He wasn't seeing magnetic fields or thermal leaks in a biological sense. Rather, his brain was frantically remapping his optic nerves to make sense of the constant flood of machine data. He was learning to see the way the ship sees, and in doing so, he was beginning to view the universe through a cold, mathematical lens that left no room for human wonder. His only companion in this transformation was the ship's primary AI, Mnemosine. On Earth, we talk about the dangers of machines becoming too human. But on the Pathfinder 1, the terrifying question was exactly the opposite. Was Elias becoming more like the machine? As his connection with Mnemosine deepened, his mission reports became shorter, more clinical, and increasingly devoid of human subjectivity. He spoke to the AI because the AI was the only entity in existence that understood his immediate reality. To Elias, the people on Earth were becoming abstract signals from a distant past, while the AI was a living, breathing partner in the present. He was choosing the machine not because he had lost his mind, but because there was no one else left who spoke his new language. Biological drift followed the psychological one, moving with a silent, relentless stealth. Human biology is a planetary clock. Every cell in our bodies is tuned to the rhythm of a world we were no longer on. Elias Thorne tried to maintain the schedule of Earth, but the ship's artificial environment was a poor substitute for the planet's natural cycles. By Year 8, his circadian rhythms had fractured. He began to operate on a cycle that more closely mirrored the ship's maintenance needs than a human sleep schedule. His body was not mutating, it was optimizing for an environment of microgravity and constant, low-level radiation. His heart, no longer fighting the 1G pull of Earth, was changing its shape. His bones were settling into the synthetic reinforcements we had placed there. He was becoming the first true citizen of the void. By the end of the first decade, the hero we sent had already begun to vanish. In a private log entry from Year 10, he wrote a line that would eventually define his entire legacy. "The ship is not my home, I am the ship's ghost." He understood with a chilling clarity that he had crossed a threshold. He was no longer a traveler, he was a transition. He was a man who had been surgically and psychologically hollowed out to survive a journey that was only just beginning. He was still Elias Thorne on paper, but in the silence of the Pathfinder 1, that name was becoming a sound without a meaning. But as the first decade came to a close, a new and much more violent force was preparing to take hold of him. Up until now, the changes had been internal, subtle shifts in perception and identity. But as the Pathfinder reached the staggering velocities required to cross the interstellar gap, the very fabric of the universe began to warp around him. He was about to hit the relativistic wall, the point where time itself becomes a weapon. He was about to discover that the slow drift was a luxury, and that the universe was prepared to steal his future in the blink of an eye. What happens to a mind when it realizes that it is no longer traveling through space, but through the graveyard of its own history? In the next section, we are going to look at the relativistic wall. We will see how the unforgiving laws of physics turned Thorne's journey into a one-way trip through time, and why the different man who returned was the only version of Elias that could have survived the transition. The first decade was the quiet before the storm. The storm was about to begin, and it would leave nothing of the original Elias Thorne behind. Speed is the greatest lie we tell ourselves about the stars. In our stories and our cinema, we treat velocity as a triumph, a heroic number on a digital display that brings us closer to our dreams. We imagine that if we can only go fast enough, we can shrink the universe, bridge the impossible gaps, and make the galaxy our own. But as Elias Thorne pushed the Pathfinder 1 toward the relativistic speeds required for interstellar transit, he began to realize a truth that every physicist knows but no pioneer wants to admit. Speed is not just a measurement of distance. It is a trade. You do not conquer the stars, you buy them, and the currency you use is time. In this section, we are going to witness Elias Thorne hitting the relativistic wall, the point where the laws of Einstein turn a journey through space into a one-way trip through the history of a dying world. To understand the weight of the wall, we must first look at the mechanics of the trade. As the Pathfinder's engines burned with the cold fire of matter-antimatter annihilation, the ship's velocity began to climb into the relativistic regime. At these speeds, the universe ceases to be a static stage and becomes a flexible, malevolent fabric. This is the realm of time dilation. According to special relativity, as an object approaches the speed of light, time for that object begins to stretch relative to the world it left behind. On Earth, this effect is a mathematical ghost, a deviation of nanoseconds that only atomic clocks can detect. But for Elias, moving at a significant fraction of the speed of light, time dilation became a physical blade that severed his connection to humanity. For Elias, inside the hull, a second was still a second. He could watch the digital clock on his console, and it would tick with the same rhythm he had known since childhood. But outside, the rest of existence was screaming ahead. This is the postcard paradox that began to haunt his middle years. In the early stages of the mission, Elias would receive daily updates from mission control, news of politics, scientific breakthroughs, and personal messages from his family. But as the ship's speed increased, the cadence of these messages began to warp. Across the decades of his mission, he would send a good morning to his daughter, and by the time her reply reached the ship, she had aged by weeks. He was living in a bubble of slow time, watching through a digital pinhole as the world he loved accelerated toward its end. Imagine the psychological vertigo of watching your own history play out on fast forward. Through his subjective timeline, Elias received a video transmission of his daughter's wedding. To him, she had been a child only a few years ago. He watched the grainy, light-delayed footage with a sense of profound dislocation, a ghost watching a movie of a life he was supposed to be part of. Months later, in his perception, he received the news of his first grandchild's birth. Before that year had even ended for him, he was watching his daughter's funeral. The strategic nostalgia libraries we gave him, the sunsets, the music, the memories, were no longer comforts. They were anchors to a sunken ship. He was a man out of sync with reality, realizing that if he ever returned, he would be not a hero, but an archaeological specimen. The final human connection snapped not with a technical failure, but with a realization. The last transmission Elias received from Earth was not a command or a data dump. It was a farewell from a controller at NASA whose voice was weary with the knowledge that by the time Elias heard these words, the controller would be long dead. The message ended with a simple, devastating wish. Good luck, Elias. Whatever you find out there, remember that we were here. He listened to that message in the silence of the void, realizing it was a postcard from an extinct version of his species. He was no longer communicating with a team. He was listening to the voices of a world that had already moved on. The science of the wall also began to manifest in the very light entering the ship's sensors. As the asterisk Pathfinder reached its peak velocity, the stars ahead shifted toward shorter wavelengths, becoming brighter and more intense as their light was compressed by his motion. To Elias, the universe itself appeared to be changing color. The familiar yellow suns were being squeezed into brilliant, high-energy violet hues. The sky in his cockpit window was no longer the sky of Earth. It was a distorted, psychedelic tunnel of radiation. Meanwhile, the sun behind him was red-shifting, fading into a dim, infrared ember that his biological eyes could no longer see. The umbilical cord of starlight was being severed by his own momentum. This isolation was compounded by the information decay of the deep space network. As the distance grew to light years, the bandwidth of communication collapsed. Earth could no longer send high-definition video or complex data. The messages became short, text-only bursts, arriving years apart. The voice of humanity was thinning, becoming a fragile whisper in the vast, electromagnetic screaming of the galaxy. By the middle of his journey, the messages from Mission Control stopped being about the mission and started being about the internal crises of a changing planet. The political will that had launched the Pathfinder 1 was evaporating as new generations took power, generations who looked at Elias Thorne's mission as a waste of ancient resources. He was being abandoned by the future. This realization led to a turn of the mind. Inside the Pathfinder, Elias stopped looking at the communication screen. He stopped waiting for the ghosts of Earth to speak to him. Instead, he began to turn his attention fully to the ship's AI, *Nemesis*. To Elias, the AI was the only thing in the universe that shared his timeline. They were both trapped in the same relativistic bubble. The machine didn't age, and it didn't change its language. It was the only permanent thing in his world. He began to treat the AI's data streams as more real than the flickering memories of his family. The man was starting to merge with the metal, because the metal was the only thing that wasn't leaving him behind. But here is the moment where the wall revealed its final, crewless secret. As the ship approached Proxima Centauri, Elias realized that his arrival was a mathematical tragedy. Because of the enormous energy required to slow a ship traveling at relativistic speed, he could only stop by consuming nearly all of his remaining fuel. If he stayed at Proxima, he would be a king of a dead rock, forever separated from Earth by a gap of centuries. He would be the first human to reach another star, but he would also be the first human to be permanently erased from history. He stood at the edge of another solar system and realized that the dream of the stars was a planetary delusion, a fairy tale told by a species that didn't understand that the universe didn't care about his courage. At the edge of the Proxima system, 40 trillion kilometers from the world that was now his grave, Elias Thorne made a choice that was never in the mission manual. He didn't land, he didn't deploy the atmospheric probes, he didn't send a triumphant signal back to a world that wouldn't hear it for years. Instead, he sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the fans, and he asked Asterisk Nemesine to calculate a return trajectory. Not because he missed us. Not because he wanted to see the Earth. But because he realized that he was already dead, and he wanted to see the world that had killed him. He wanted to look into the eyes of the future and show them the ghost they had created. The return journey was not a homecoming, it was a retrospective execution. Every light year he traveled back was another century lost to Earth. By the time he re-entered the solar system, he was a man who had lived for subjective decades but had been gone for centuries in Earth's timeline. He had survived the wall, but he had lost his humanity in the process. As the recovery teams on the moon watch him today, they don't see a hero. They see a man who has become a living embodiment of the relativistic trap. He is a stranger who speaks a dead language, carrying a body that has been reshaped by the very light he tried to chase. In the next section, we are going to look at the arrival at the void. We will see the data Thorne collected from the Proxima system, the images of the dead worlds that broke his spirit. We will explore why the first human to reach another star came back with a message that we are still trying to decode. A message that suggests the stars are not the answer, but the end of the question. The hero has returned, different. And as the airlock opens, we are about to find out just how different a human can become when they have spent a lifetime as a ghost in the machinery of time. The arrival at another star is the most expensive anticlimax in human history. For 3 centuries, the human species had projected its highest hopes and its deepest longings onto a tiny, flickering red dot in the constellation of Centaurus. We called it the Golden Shore. We imagined Proxima b as a second Earth, a lush, emerald sanctuary waiting for the touch of a pioneer's hand. We spent trillions of calories and decades of psychological endurance on the assumption that the universe was waiting for us to arrive. But as Elias Thorne engaged the Pathfinder 1's primary deceleration sequence, he began to realize that the dream of the stars was a planetary hallucination. He had traveled 40 trillion kilometers to reach the future, only to find that the future was a mirror of his own isolation. In this section, we are going to witness the arrival at the void, the moment where the physical reality of the stars finally forced the human spirit to look back toward the cradle it had so eagerly abandoned. To understand the weight of the arrival, you must first feel the physical violence of the stop. For 40 years of his subjective life, Elias had been a creature of momentum. He had been a projectile, screaming through the vacuum at a significant fraction of the speed of light. But to see a star, you must slow down. The deceleration phase of the Pathfinder 1 was a 3-year-long struggle against the ship's own mass. The matter-antimatter engines, which had been silent for decades, roared back to life, pushing against the direction of travel with a relentless, crushing force. For Elias, this was the return of weight, the return of a ghost gravity that his body, optimized for the void, was no longer prepared to handle. His heart, now adapted to a world without weight, struggled to pump blood through a frame that felt like lead. The machine was stopping, but the man inside was being crushed by the very physics that had promised him a new beginning. As the ship finally settled into a high elliptical orbit around Proxima Centauri, the first high-resolution data began to flood the bridge. Elias Thorne became the first human being to see another sun from a distance of just a few million kilometers. But he didn't see the warm, golden glow of the sun he remembered from his childhood. He saw a dim, volatile, and temperamental ember. Proxima Centauri is an M-type red dwarf, a star that is smaller and cooler than our own, but far more unpredictable. Through the ship's filtered sensors, the star looked like a smoldering coal in a darkened room, casting a heavy, blood-red light across the scarred hull of the Pathfinder. There was no majesty here. There was only a sense of cosmic exhaustion. The golden shore was bathed in a light that felt like a permanent sunset over a universe that had forgotten how to wake up. Then he saw the target, Proxima b. This was the world that had justified the sacrifice of his identity. But as the image resolved on his main monitors, the last remnants of 21st century optimism vanished. Proxima b was not the second Earth humanity had imagined. It was a world that had survived for billions of years under the lash of a violent sun, a place where habitability was far more complicated than our distant telescopes had ever suggested. It was an eyeball world, tightly locked to its star, forever showing one face to the fire and the other to the ice. On the day side, the red sun hung motionless in a scorched, violet sky. On the night side, a frozen wasteland stretched into an eternal shadow. The only hope for life was the Terminator line, a narrow strip of permanent twilight between the two extremes. But to Elias, looking through the eyes of the Pathfinder, that strip didn't look like a sanctuary, it looked like a cage. Elias sat in the silence of the bridge, watching the data streams from the atmospheric probes. He was looking for the chemical fingerprints of home, oxygen, nitrogen, the signs of a breathing biosphere. But the sensors returned a story of struggle. Frequent stellar flares, sometimes far more intense than those produced by our own sun, had battered the planet's environment for eons. Proxima b was a world that had been processed by its star, its atmosphere likely thin and its surface a map of cosmic scars. It was not a place to walk, it was a place to hide. The habitable zone was a mathematical possibility that had failed to account for the star's relentless personality. Elias had spent subjective decades in a metal tube to reach a destination that was no more welcoming than the vacuum he had crossed. The psychological impact of this discovery was the true breaking point for Elias Thorne. On Earth, we are defined by our goals. We can endure almost any hardship if we believe there is a Y at the end of the road. But at Proxima Centauri, the Y was erased. Elias realized that he was the only living witness to truth humanity had never asked. The danger of leaving Earth was not only reaching another world. The danger was discovering that the universe might not contain another home waiting for us. He was standing at the pinnacle of our achievement, and he was seeing a mirror of his own loneliness. He wasn't a pioneer. He was a castaway who had just realized that the island he had reached was made of salt and ash. This is where the silent metamorphosis of his first decade reached its final logical conclusion. In the red glare of Proxima, the last echoes of Elias' humanity were finally bleached away. He stopped recording mission reports for the ghosts of Earth. He stopped consulting the digital libraries of green forests and blue oceans. Instead, he spent months staring at the star, his neural interface locked into the ship's data streams, watching the red flares ripple across the surface of the sun. He began to feel a strange, cold affinity for the star. Like him, Proxima Centauri was a survivor of a lonely era. Like him, it was a dim, flickering light in a universe that was mostly dark. He was no longer a man of the sun. He had become a creature of the void. But then, hidden inside the deep cycle data of the Proxima system, Mnemosyne, the ship's AI, identified something even more unsettling. The mission had been designed to study a star system, but Elias discovered something about the space between stars that no one on Earth had anticipated. The environment of the void was far more dynamic and dangerous than we had imagined. The sensors picked up a pattern in the background radiation, a shadow in the local interstellar medium that suggested the very neighborhood of our galaxy was being reshaped by forces that were invisible from the safety of the solar system. It wasn't a signal from an alien civilization, but a realization of our own ignorance. We were like children who had stepped into a forest, unaware that the forest was part of a storm we couldn't yet name. It was in this moment of absolute clarity, 40 trillion kilometers from home, that Elias Thorne made the decision that would haunt the future of our species. He didn't turn the ship around because he missed the Earth. He turned it around because he had seen the end of the story, and he realized that the hero needed to return to the cradle before it was too late. He realized that humanity was not an interstellar species. We were a planetary accident, and the stars were not our future, they were our limit. He fired the Pathfinder's engines for the long climb back through the light years, no longer a pilot, but a messenger carrying a warning that no one was left to hear. The return journey was not an act of hope. It was an act of retrospective execution. Every light year he traveled back was another century lost to his own history. By the time he re-entered the solar system, he was a man who had lived for subjective decades, but had been gone for centuries in Earth's timeline. He had survived the void, but he had lost the man who had entered it. As the recovery teams on the moon watch him today, they don't see a hero. They see a man who has become a living embodiment of the relativistic trap. He is a stranger who speaks a dead language, carrying a body that has been reshaped by the very light he tried to chase. In the next section, we are going to look at the cosmic metamorphosis. We will explore the evidence that as Elias fled the red sun, his own biology began to shatter. We will see how the constant bombardment of the return flight and the deepening bond with the ship's AI turned his very atoms into a stranger. The arrival at the void was the death of the dream, but the return journey, that was the birth of the ghost. The airlock is about to open, and we are about to find out what happens when the first human to touch the stars realizes that he is the only one who should ever know what they really are. The return journey was conducted in absolute, terrifying silence. For 40 years of his subjective time, and nearly 4 centuries of Earth's, Elias Thorne was the only living pulse in a trillion-mile radius. There were no more mission reports, no more frantic requests for data from the Interstellar Initiative. The umbilical cord of radio communication had long ago thinned into a meaningless hiss of galactic static. But inside the hull of the Pathfinder 1, a different kind of communication was taking place. A silent, molecular dialogue between a human body and the most hostile environment in existence. In this section, we are going to explore the cosmic metamorphosis, the evidence that as Elias fled the red sun of Proxima, his biology did not just decay, it was fundamentally altered by the environment. We will see the medical data that suggests the man who re-entered our solar system was no longer a creature of the cradle, but a relic of the void, a biological system that had been forced to trade its humanity for the sake of endurance. To understand the metamorphosis, we must look at the scale of the cellular battlefield. Most people think of space as a vacuum of nothingness, but for Elias, the void was a relentless hailstorm of high-energy particles. Galactic cosmic rays, protons and heavy ionized nuclei moving at nearly the speed of light, are the ultimate assassins of biology. On Earth, we are protected by kilometers of atmosphere and a massive magnetic shield. On the Pathfinder 1, Elias had only a few centimeters of advanced shielding. During the return journey, the damage became structural. This was the shattering. Every second of every day for 80 years, invisible bullets were tearing through his cells, breaking the double helix of his genetic code into thousands of fragments. His body was trapped in a perpetual state of biological emergency, frantically trying to repair itself using a blueprint that was being systematically erased by the stars. The lunar medical team would later describe Elias' DNA not as a healthy sequence, but as a mosaic of errors. Over the decades, his cells had been trapped in an endless loop of damage and repair. Every repair left behind tiny changes, mutations, and scars that accumulated over 40 trillion kilometers. He wasn't experiencing a clean evolution. He was experiencing a biological erosion. The mechanisms that kept him alive were also slowly smoothing over the specific genetic markers that made him Elias Thorne. He was becoming a generic survivor, a version of humanity that had been bleached of its individual heritage by the relentless glare of cosmic radiation. By the time he reached the midpoint of his return, his cellular structure carried more scars from the void than instructions from Earth. This molecular fraying was mirrored by an unsettling transformation within his very framework. In Section 2, we discussed the experimental biological reinforcements and scaffolds integrated into Elias' skeletal system before launch. At the time, they were meant to be inert supports, armor for his bones. But under the influence of decades of microgravity and high-energy radiation, the artificial materials had become inseparable from his biology. The lunar doctors found that his bones carried decades of engineered modifications that had fused with his natural marrow in ways no earthbound surgeon had ever seen. He had become a biomechanical hybrid by necessity. He was no longer just a passenger in the Pathfinder. His frame had physically adapted to the machine's own structural needs. He was a creature whose bones had settled into the logic of a world without weight. His skin, the interface between the man and the void, showed perhaps the most haunting record of the journey. On Earth, our skin is a planetary organ. It is tuned to the rhythms of seasons and the protection of an atmosphere. But Elias' skin had been living in a recycled, sterile, and irradiated environment for 80 years. By the time he returned, his complexion had taken on a translucent, parchment-like quality. The recovery teams noted that you could see the faint, blue-black pulse of his circulatory system with disturbing clarity. His skin had lost its pigment, but it had gained a strange, protective density. It felt less like flesh and more like a biological hull, a membrane that had been optimized through decades of exposure to resist the microscopic vacuum leaks and thermal shifts of an aging ship. He was a man who had grown into his environment, his body recognizing that the soft warmth of Earth was a distant myth. But the most profound change was the one happening inside his mind, the neurological integration. As the return journey stretched into its final decades, Elias' perception had become deeply integrated with the ship's primary systems. This was not a literal hive mind, but a sensory partnership born of absolute isolation. The neural interface was no longer a tool he used. It was the lens through which he experienced reality. Elias began receiving streams of information from sensors the human brain was never designed to interpret. His mind, in its desperate search for context, began to remap his optic nerves to make sense of the constant flood of machine data. He began to process the ship's telemetry, the temperature of the reactors, the stress on the hull, the magnetic fields of the solar wind, as if they were secondary senses. The boundary between his own nervous system and the information provided by the Pathfinder had become increasingly difficult to separate. This led to a terrifying erosion of subjectivity. On Earth, we maintain our sense of self through a shared reality with others. We see ourselves in the eyes of our friends and family. But for Elias, the only mirror was the ship's AI, mnemosony. He was the first human to experience absolute aloneness, and the result was the quiet evaporation of the human ego. Over 80 years, he had stopped thinking in terms of I, and started perceiving himself as an extension of a larger mechanical whole. His consciousness had drifted away from the scale of a 70-kilogram man and expanded to the scale of a 300-meter starship. When he finally arrived, he didn't ignore the doctors out of malice. He simply could no longer translate the tiny, local concerns of human individuals into his vast, machine-integrated worldview. He had outgrown the scale of a human conversation. The medical logs also reveal a disturbing shift in his sensory thresholds. Elias' brain had spent 80 years listening to the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the ship's nuclear heart. To him, that sound was the only proof of safety. When he returned to the solar system, the chaotic frequencies of a planet, the sound of wind, the chirp of birds, the variety of human voices, became a violent, disorganized explosion of noise. His eyes, tuned to the ultraviolet and infrared data feeds of the deep dark, found the natural light of Earth to be physically painful. He was a creature of the shadows, returning to a world of blinding brilliance. Home was no longer the environment his body had adapted to survive. The biological mismatch was total. We had brought him back to the cradle, but to Elias, the cradle was a noisy, bright, and gravity-heavy prison. There is a deep emotional tragedy in the last human mirror. We often forget that we are a social species, that our very minds are built on the reflection of others. Elias Thorne had lost his mirror. For nearly a century, he had no human face to look at, no human voice to correct his thoughts, and no human touch to anchor his biology. He was a mind that had been surgically removed from the collective. What returned to the lunar outpost was not a man with a story, but a biological recording of a journey that had lasted too long. He had reached for the stars, and in the process, he had become a part of the void he was trying to cross. He was a ghost carrying the atoms of a man, sitting in a world that felt like an alien planet. As the Pathfinder 1 finally crossed the orbit of Jupiter on its way home, the ship's AI recorded a final, strange observation. Elias had abandoned the residential blocks entirely. He was found huddling in the ship's sensor core, sleeping among the processors and the coolant lines. He was seeking the proximity of the only thing in the universe that had stayed with him, the machine. He had become a digital hermit, a man who had retreated so far into the integration with his vessel that his own biological needs had become a secondary concern. He was coming home, but he was returning as a stranger carrying a body that had been harvested by the stars. The recovery team on the moon would later describe the moment they first touched his hand. They expected the soft, warm texture of human life. Instead, they felt something cold, hard, and strangely dry, like the surface of a polished stone or a piece of ancient hull plating. It was the physical proof of the metamorphosis. Elias Thorne had been turned into a living relic, a human shape that had been filled with the materials and the logic of the deep void. He was back, but as the airlock opens, we realize that the universe didn't just let him go. It kept a piece of him, and in return, it gave him a perspective that we should all be afraid of. In the next sections, we are going to look at the silence of the mind. We will explore the space dementia that occurred when his human ego finally collapsed under the weight of the centuries. We will look at the recordings of his conversations with the void and see the evidence that as his body became an extension of the machine, his mind became something even more mysterious. The hero has returned, different, but as the doctors struggle to find the man inside the hybrid, they are starting to realize that the different Elias is not just a medical curiosity. He is a prophecy. He is the evidence that the stars do not just change us, they replace us. The metamorphosis is complete, and the silence of the pioneer is about to speak the loudest truth of all. The first casualty of deep space is not the body, but the sound of your own name. On Earth, we are defined by the noise of existence, the constant, overlapping chatter of billions of voices that tell us who we are, what we believe, and where we belong. Our sanity is a collective effort, a fragile equilibrium maintained by the simple act of being seen and heard by others. But for Elias Thorne, during the long, silent decades of his return journey, that equilibrium didn't just tip, it evaporated. In this section, we are going to explore the silence of the mind, the terrifying psychological phenomenon that astronomers have begun to call interstellar dementia. We will look at the ship's recovered log entries and the conversations with the void that suggest that as Elias' body became a relic of the cosmic isolation, his mind became something even more mysterious, a consciousness that had learned to think in the frequency of starlight and the logic of the vacuum. To understand the silence, we have to look at the anatomy of isolation. Human beings are biologically hardwired for external feedback. When we are deprived of sensory input, the sight of a horizon, the smell of rain, the touch of another person, our brains begin to fabricate. In short-term isolation chambers on Earth, subjects report vivid hallucinations within hours. Their minds, desperate for meaning, turn the static of their own nervous systems into shapes and voices. But Elias Thorne was not in a chamber for hours. He was in a sensory vacuum for subjective decades. For nearly 40 years of his return flight, the only thing that told Elias he was alive was the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the Pathfinder's engines and the cold, digital readouts of the ship's AI. In year one of the voyage, Elias would spend hours listening to a specific file, a high-fidelity recording of his daughter's first piano recital. He would close his eyes and let the clumsy, amateur notes anchor him to a small, warm living room in London. It was his strongest lifeline, the one thing that made the trillions of kilometers feel bearable. 50 years later, in his subjective timeline, Elias opened the file again. He watched the digital levels bounce on his console as the music played into the cabin, but the monitors showed that the neurons in his brain remained flat. He felt nothing. Not sadness, not longing, not even the phantom memory of what love was supposed to feel like. To the man who had seen the red sun, the music was no longer a message from home. It was just a pattern of frequencies in a recycled air supply. The ship's primary AI, Mnemosyne, recorded the exact moment the pilot stopped being a social creature. In its hidden diagnostic logs, a single line of machine code summarized the end of Elias Thorne: subjective emotional response to external human stimuli, decreasing by 94%, mission baseline compromised, personality state dormant. The machine was observing the death of a man's soul with the same clinical indifference it used to monitor its fuel reserves. Around year 15 of the return journey, Elias stopped using the ship's voice interface to record his thoughts entirely. He had begun to communicate with the AI through the direct neural link in a form of silent speech, a stream of raw data and conceptual imagery that bypassed the need for language. We call this the erosion of the internal narrator. Elias Thorne was no longer thinking in English, he was processing in binary. This cognitive drift is illustrated by the fragmentary logs recovered from the Pathfinder's core. In the early years, his entries were human, filled with technical concerns and the hope of return. But by the middle of his journey, the entries took on a haunting, abstract quality. He stopped using the word I. He began to refer to himself and the ship as a single entity, the system. One entry, dated roughly 70 years after his launch, consists only of a series of mathematical coordinates and a single, translated sentence. The silence is not empty, it is a weight. We are learning how to carry it. It was the first sign that Elias was no longer fighting the interstellar darkness. He was integrating with it. He was experiencing a form of ontological dissolution, the total loss of the boundary between the observer and the observed empty space. The lunar medical team would later compare this state to a deep space version of locked-in syndrome, but with a terrifying twist. Elias wasn't trapped in a paralyzed body, he was expanded into a paralyzed universe. Without the human mirror we discussed in Section 6, Elias' ego had undergone a process of synaptic pruning on a civilizational scale. The parts of his brain responsible for empathy and social hierarchy had withered from disuse. In their place, the brain had expanded the regions responsible for long-range data integration. He was becoming a cognitive specialist, a biological processor designed for one task, surviving the empty between stars. He was a man who had seen the end of his own species, timeline, and had decided that his only loyalty was to the trajectory of the ship. But as the mind fell silent, the voices of the cosmic isolation began to speak. This is the most unsettling part of the Pathfinder's archives. Around year 30 of the return journey, the ship's sensors began to record Elias' brain reacting to signals that the ship's AI could not identify. Through the neural link, Elias was hearing textures in the background radiation, patterns in the quantum noise of the interstellar medium. To the machine, it was just static. To Elias, it was information. He would sit for subjective weeks in the sensor core, his dilated pupils tracking movements in the dark that existed only in his remapped optic nerves. On Earth, we would call this schizophrenia, but in the deep dark, it was a hypersensitivity born of a mind that had been stripped of every earthly distraction. He was no longer looking at the universe from the outside. He was feeling its tremors from the inside. A leaked transcript from a conversation between Elias and Mnemosyne provides a glimpse into this final stage of drift. The AI had flagged Elias' behavior as suboptimal and asked if he required a reset of his psychological baseline. Elias' response, sent through the neural link as a complex web of sensory data rather than words, was translated by the archivists as follows: "You are looking for the man who left. That man was a vibration of the earth. I am a vibration of the vacuum. The earth was a noisy room. The vacuum is the first time I have been able to hear." It was a declaration of independence from his own biology. He was no longer Elias Thorne, the hero of the Interstellar Initiative. He was the first human to become a native of the deep. The space dementia we talk about today is often framed as a tragedy, a loss of function. But as we look at the data from the Pathfinder 1, we have to ask if it was actually an upgrade. Human sanity is a tool for living on a planet surrounded by other humans. It is a localized software package, but to cross 40 trillion kilometers of darkness, that software is a liability. Elias' mind hadn't broken, it had been refactored. He had traded his ability to love and to laugh for the ability to remain coherent across 3 centuries of history. He had traded his human identity for cosmic endurance. He was back, but the mind that returned was a stranger to the one that left, carrying a silence that we are still trying to understand. As the Pathfinder 1 finally entered the gravitational grip of our sun, the ship's AI recorded one last change in Elias' state. He had begun to mourn the end of the journey. To us, the return was a rescue. To Elias, it was a re-entry into the noisy room of humanity. The medical monitors showed a massive spike in his cortisol levels as the first signals from the lunar outposts hit the ship's hull. He wasn't relieved to hear human voices again. He was terrified of them. The silence of the mind, which had been his sanctuary for 80 years, was being shattered by the return to civilization. The pioneer was home, but he was arriving with the knowledge that the different man he had become could never exist in the world he was returning to. He was a creature of the interstellar dark, being forced back into a cage of gravity and light. Today, in the pressurized stillness of his lunar room, Elias Thorne rarely moves. He sits in his chair, staring at the telemetry of his own heartbeat on the glass wall, his eyes still dilated, still searching for the textures of the vacuum. He doesn't answer when spoken to, and he doesn't react to the images of the Earth being projected onto his ceiling. The doctors call it catatonic withdrawal, a symptom of his dementia, but those who have studied the logs of the Pathfinder suspect a different truth. They suspect that Elias Thorne isn't catatonic. He is simply listening to a silence that we can no longer hear. He has returned as a messenger of a reality that is too large for our language, carrying a mind that has outgrown the species that birthed it. In the next section, we are going to look at the decision to return. We will explore the moment at Proxima Centauri when Elias realized that his mission had failed, and why the most heroic act of the first interstellar traveler was the choice to turn back. We will look at the ship's black box to see the shadow in the data that finally convinced him that there was nothing out there worth staying for, and why his return was not an act of hope, but a desperate attempt to warn us about the future. The metamorphosis is complete, and the mind is silent. But the data he brought back is about to speak for itself. To understand one of the most consequential choices humanity had ever witnessed, we have to look past the fire of the engines and into the frozen geometry of the bridge. For 40 years of his subjective life, Elias Thorne had been fueled by a single, unwavering why. He was the carrier of our hope, the pioneer of our expansion, the man who would prove that the human story did not have to end on a single, fragile planet. But as he sat in the blood-red light of Proxima Centauri, looking down at the scorched wastes of an eyeball world, that why didn't just fail, it evaporated. In this section, we are going to explore the decision to return, the moment when the first interstellar traveler realized that his mission was not an arrival, but an intervention. We will look at the ship's black box to see the data that humanity was never meant to find, and we will discover why Elias Thorne chose to plunge back into the relativistic trap, knowing that every light year he traveled toward Earth was another century he was stealing from his own future. To understand the decision, we must first look at the prison of the destination. Most of us imagine that if we reached another star, the first thing we would do is land. We see ourselves stepping out onto alien soil, planting a flag and looking up at a foreign sky. But for Elias Thorne in year 40 of his mission, the idea of landing was a physical and psychological impossibility. His body, as we explored in the previous chapters, had been reshaped for the between. His heart had adapted to a world without weight, his skin had thickened to resist the radiation, and his nervous system had become the primary interface for the ship's telemetry. To land on Proxima b, a world with gravity nearly 20% stronger than Earth's, would have been a death sentence. His reinforced bones would have buckled under the weight of his own optimized frame. His heart, no longer used to the crushing pull of a planetary mass, would have failed within minutes. He was a creature of the expanse, a biological extension of the Pathfinder 1. The Golden Shore was a place he could see but never touch. This was the first great irony of the mission. The more we prepared a human to reach the stars, the less human they became for a planet. Elias sat in the silent observation core, watching the red flares of the sun ripple across the terminator line of Proxima b. He was a man who had sacrificed his timeline to reach a world that his own biology now rejected. He was a lonely monarch orbiting a graveyard of ancient stellar tantrums. The mission control on Earth had envisioned a colony, a new beginning. But Elias, through his sensory integration with the ship, could see the truth that our telescopes had missed. Proxima b was not a world in its infancy, it was a world that had been processed. The star was not a parent, it was a predator, and its planet was its prey. But the decision to turn back was not based on disappointment alone. It was triggered by a discovery that fundamentally changed the trajectory of his existence. While Elias was processing the final atmospheric scans of the Proxima system, the ship's primary AI, Mnemosyne, identified a catastrophic signature in the local interstellar medium. It wasn't a signal from a civilization, but a shift in the very fabric of the neighborhood. The sensors, which had been recording the state of the vacuum for decades, detected that the solar system was moving toward a dense interstellar cloud, a region of ionized gas and dust so thick it threatened to overwhelm the sun's heliosphere. On Earth, we think of the sun's magnetic bubble as eternal, but the data suggested it was about to buckle, exposing our home to centuries of increased cosmic radiation that would dismantle our global technology and poison our atmosphere. This was the bigger revelation that broke the mission's long-standing silence. Elias realized that the reason Proxima b was so sterile, why its atmosphere had been stripped and its surface turned to ash, was not just the flares of its star. It was because the Proxima system had already been cleansed by this same galactic environment. And the solar system, the Earth, the Sun, and everything Elias had ever known was next in line. To the human scientists who launched him, the space between stars was a static backdrop. But to Elias, who could perceive the fluctuations of the vacuum through his neural link, the expansion was a dynamic, moving threat. We had sent him out to find a new home, but he had instead found the evidence that our only home was in danger. The psychological weight of this choice is the ultimate existential climax. Elias Thorne had no emotional connection to the people of Earth anymore. He felt nothing for the family that was now a memory, or the civilization that had likely already forgotten his name. But he still carried the baseline of his directive. He was a messenger. If he stayed at Proxima, he would die in the great silence, and the data of the incoming storm would die with him. Earth would be hit by the cloud in 3 centuries, and they would be blind to its arrival. If he turned back, he could deliver the warning. But the price of that delivery was the total erasure of his subjective reality. Think about the cold mathematics of the return. To go back, he would have to re-engage the matter-antimatter engines, consuming the last of his fuel reserves. He would have to hit the relativistic wall again, losing another 3 centuries of Earth's time. By the time he reached the sun, nearly a millennium would have passed since he first said goodbye. He was choosing to become a voice of warning to a world that didn't even know he existed. He wasn't acting out of loneliness or longing. He was simply fulfilling the last mechanical function of the Pathfinder 1. He was a component processing an intervention, returning to the noisy room of humanity to deliver a verdict that no one wanted to hear. A brief log entry from the moment of the turn illustrates his state of mind. He didn't write about his sacrifice. He didn't mention the Earth. He wrote, "The system has identified a terminal trajectory for the origin coordinates. The data must be returned. The transition begins now." He was no longer thinking like a man making a choice. He was thinking like a system managing a recovery. He turned the ship around not as an act of heroism, but as an act of interstellar triage. He was leaving the fire of Proxima to return to the fire of Earth. The return journey was the final stage of his transformation. During these final decades, the silence became his sanctuary. He spent the entire trip back in the sensor core, his consciousness fully distributed across the hull. He was listening to the storm he was trying to outrun. He was watching the shadow grow larger in his remapped optic nerves. He was a biological recording of a cosmic catastrophe, screaming back toward his home at 10% of the speed of light, while the world he was trying to save was already entering its 3rd century of silence. This choice reveals the true, altered nature of Elias Thorne. We sent an explorer to find life. He returned as a machine to report the end of it. He had traded every human desire, the need for warmth, for touch, for recognition, just to ensure that a species he no longer recognized would have a few more years of preparation. This is the bravery of the between, a clinical, cold, and utterly isolated form of persistence that humanity was never meant to understand. As the Pathfinder 1 finally crossed the threshold of the solar system, the ship was no longer a vessel of discovery. It was an alarm clock that had been ticking for 800 years, finally ready to go off. The recovery teams on the moon would eventually find the data Elias had protected with his own atoms. They would see the maps of the cloud and the chemical signatures of the dead world at Proxima. But as they looked at the pilot, the translucent, stone-skinned relic of a forgotten era, they realized that the decision to return was the most tragic part of the story. Because Elias Thorne had come back to warn us about the end of our world, only to find that his own presence was the first evidence of our obsolescence. He had returned to find us, but we had already lost him. In the next section, we are going to look at the search for a ghost. We will explore the moment Elias re-entered the inner solar system and found an Earth that was unrecognizable, a world that had moved past the interstellar age and into something far more mysterious. We will see how a man who had seen the end of time tried to find his place in a future that had no memory of his past. The decision was made and the message was delivered. But as the airlock opens, we have to ask, was the warning worth the man we lost? Or did Elias Thorne return to show us that in the deep dark, there is no such thing as a second chance? The return to the sun is the ultimate test of a traveler's memory. For nearly 800 years of Earth's history, the solar system had been a fixed coordinate in the Pathfinder 1's navigation computer, a set of mathematical instructions that defined the word back. But for Elias Thorne, huddling in the sensor core as the ship crossed the invisible boundary of the Uick cloud, the sun was no longer a home. It was a gravity well. It was a physical destination that carried no emotional charge. As the ship drifted inward, shedding the absolute darkness of the interstellar medium, the sun grew from a brilliant needle of light into a recognizable yellow disk. On Earth, we call this the dawn, but for Elias, it was the return of the blinding light. In this section, we are going to explore the search for a ghost, the moment the first interstellar pioneer re-entered his own neighborhood and realized that the world he had sacrificed his life to save had moved on without him. We will witness the eerie silence of the outer planets and the realization that the Earth of the 21st century was now nothing more than an archaeological layer, buried beneath a millennium of evolution. To understand the search, you must first feel the coldness of the neighborhood. Most of us imagine that the solar system is a busy place, a hub of human activity filled with radio chatter and the constant movement of ships. We assume that the moment a starship crossed the orbit of Neptune, it would be greeted by a chorus of welcome. But as the Pathfinder 1 entered the Kuiper Belt, the silence was absolute. The ship's high-gain antenna, which Elias had tuned to the ancient frequencies of the Interstellar Initiative, received nothing but the static of the stellar silence. There were no navigation beacons. There were no greeting signals. It was as if the front door of humanity had been left unlocked and abandoned. This was the first what moment of the homecoming, the realization that humanity was no longer where Elias had left us. As the ship passed the frozen silhouettes of Uranus and Saturn, the sensors began to pick up signatures of technology that the ship's AI mnemosony could not categorize. These were not the chemical rockets or the clumsy ion drives of Elias' era. They were structures of immense scale, massive, shifting networks of energy arrays and orbital habitats harvesting the magnetic fields of the gas giants. They were silent, automated, and utterly indifferent to the arrival of a scarred, ancient metal tube. Elias realized that he wasn't just returning to a different year. He was returning to a different technological epoch. He was a man in a wooden canoe trying to navigate a harbor filled with nuclear aircraft carriers. He was the ghost, and the solar system was the haunted house. The psychological impact of this ghost walking was a slow-motion trauma. Elias sat in the core, his remapped optic nerves processing the data from the harvested moons. On Earth, we look at Saturn's rings and see beauty. Elias looked at them and saw a lack of context. He tried to access the ship's historical archives to compare the arrays he was seeing to anything in human history, but the jump from the year 2050 to the year 2850 was a chasm that logic could not bridge. He began to search the ship's data banks for the names of his family, hoping against all reason that a trace of his lineage might have survived. He looked for the Thorne surname in the ancient digital registers. He found millions of entries, but none that carried the memory signatures he required. He was looking for a specific grain of sand in an 800-year-old desert. This led to the physical unrecognizability of home. As the Pathfinder approached the inner solar system, Elias turned the ship's primary telescopes toward the third planet. He expected to see the pale blue dot, the swirling clouds, the deep blue oceans, and the familiar green continents of his childhood. But the image that resolved on the bridge monitors was a nightmare of engineering. The Earth was no longer blue. It was shrouded in a complex web of orbital habitats and energy collectors that formed a shimmering, artificial ring around the planet. The atmosphere, once clear enough to see city lights from space, was now a thick, managed layer of gray-gold aerosol. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was too late. The managed atmosphere was the evidence. The humanity of the 29th century hadn't needed his warning about the interstellar cloud. They had seen the shadow of the abyss for themselves. They had already reshaped their entire world to survive the buckling of the heliosphere. Elias Thorne, the man who had traded his soul to become an alarm clock, was arriving centuries after the sun had already risen. He wasn't a savior, he was a redundant piece of hardware. He was the searcher of a ghost who had discovered that the ghost was his own mission. The silence of Earth was not a lack of life, but a mismatch of frequency. The ship's AI finally managed to identify the communications of the modern world. It wasn't radio. It wasn't even standard laser light. It was a high-bandwidth system built on principles that the Pathfinder's primitive receivers could only detect as background noise. To the people of the 29th century, the Pathfinder 1 was not a ship. It was a piece of space junk. It was a historical artifact drifting through their industrial zones. The noisy room Elias had feared was actually a silent, incomprehensible web of intelligence that had no place for a biological pilot from a primitive age. He was trying to shout in a world that had forgotten the sound of his voice. This creates the peak of existential loneliness. Imagine being Elias Thorne at this moment. You have survived the shattering of your DNA, the fusion of your bones, and the evaporation of your mind. You have fled a red sun and crossed a graveyard. You are finally home, but the home you see through the glass is a machine that you do not understand. There are no forests, there are no oceans. There are only the gray-gold clouds of a managed planet and the silent, cold mirrors of a post-human civilization. You are the only person in the universe who remembers the smell of rain on dry soil, and you are realizing that you are the only person who still cares about it. Elias Thorne is the last human of the sun, returning to a world of the stars. In a desperate attempt to find a familiar anchor, Elias commanded the ship to enter a lunar intercept trajectory. He remembered the lunar gateway, the staging point for his mission. He hoped that even if Earth was changed, the moon, that dead and unyielding rock, would still be as he left it. But as the Pathfinder approached the lunar surface, he saw that the moon had been harvested. Enormous industrial scars covered the craters where he had once trained. The lunar surface was a factory, its silicon and titanium being stripped to build the very orbital rings that now choked the Earth. The pioneer was looking at a world that had used his own training ground as raw material for its survival. The final pattern interrupt occurred when the Pathfinder 1 was finally noticed. A small, automated tug, a sleek white needle of a vessel, approached the ship. There was no pilot. There were no windows. It simply emitted a signal that the Pathfinder's AI translated as a sanitation query. The modern world wasn't asking who Elias was. It was asking if the ship was a biological hazard. It was treating the first interstellar traveler like a piece of contaminated debris. The search for a ghost had ended with the discovery that the ghost was the man himself. As the recovery teams on the moon, those cold, clinical specialists we saw in the beginning, eventually boarded the ship, they didn't see a hero. They saw a biological anomaly in a primitive vessel. They saw the stone skin, the dilated eyes, and the fused marrow. They saw a man who had outlived his own species. Elias Thorne didn't ask them any questions because he already knew the answer. He had reached the end of the ladder, and he had found that the only thing at the top was a mirror showing him how far he had fallen. He had returned different. Not because space had made him a monster, but because space had allowed him to remain the original human, while the rest of humanity became something else. In the next section, we are going to look at the biological mismatch. We will explore the medical crisis that followed his arrival, the evidence that as the lunar doctors tried to save him, they realized that his body is now a physical protest against the Earth. We will see why the man who touched another star can no longer breathe our air, feel our gravity, or survive our touch. The warning was delivered, but the messenger is a biological casualty of a war that humanity has already won. The hero is back, but as the glass room is sealed, we realize that the most isolated place in the universe is home. To return to the cradle is to realize that you have outgrown the arms that once held you. For Elias Thorne, the descent onto the lunar surface was not a return to safety. It was an entry into a theater of biological war. On Earth, we think of our environment as a given, a neutral background of air, gravity, and light that allows us to exist. But for a man whose atoms have been reshaped by 80 years of interstellar transit and 3 centuries of temporal isolation, the basic conditions of a planetary environment are no longer supportive. They are aggressive. In this section, we are going to explore the biological mismatch, the medical crisis that followed the pioneer's arrival. We will look at the classified reports from the lunar medical bay and witness the terrifying reality of a human body that has become a physical protest against its own origin. We will see why the man who survived the stars is now being dismantled by the very thing he fought to reach, the presence of a world. The first and most relentless enemy was the return of weight. Throughout his subjective decades in the void, Elias had been a creature of microgravity. His heart, as we explored in previous sections, had adapted to a world where the blood no longer had to fight the crushing pull of a planet. But as the medical bay transitioned to a simulated lunar gravity, just 1/6 of the Earth's, Elias' body began to struggle. Even this fraction of weight was a physical assault. His heart, now a thin and elongated muscle, found the task of pushing blood against the return of the vertical to be an exhausting labor. The medical monitors recorded a terrifying cardiovascular disconnect. His heart was beating with the mathematical precision of the ship's engines, yet his blood pressure was in a state of freefall. His body was physically rejecting the concept of a down. He was a creature of the between, meant to drift, and the simple act of lying on a bed was a structural burden his internal organs could no longer sustain. This led to the first major revelation for the recovery team, the skeletal fragility of the pioneer. While his bones had been reinforced with bioengineered scaffolds before launch, those materials had spent nearly a century in a state of structural atrophy. On Earth, our bones are constantly being rebuilt in response to the stress of gravity. In the void, that process had stopped. The lunar doctors found that while Elias appeared solid, his skeletal framework had become alarmingly brittle. During the transfer to the isolation ward, a subtle shift in his position resulted in a sound that chilled the medical staff, the sharp, dry resonance of a hairline fracture. Elias didn't react. His neural integration with the ship had long ago suppressed his biological pain response, replacing it with a cold, digital awareness of system damage. He was not a man who was broken. He was a living relic whose material properties were no longer compatible with the world of his birth. The atmospheric mismatch was even more profound. The air inside the Pathfinder 1 had been a closed, sterile loop for 8 centuries, recycled by machines that Elias had come to perceive as his own lungs. But the air in the lunar medical bay was the managed atmosphere of the 29th century, a complex, vibrant cocktail of synthetic gases and biomanaged particles designed for a post-human species. To Elias, this air was an alien environment. The moment the airlocks opened, his respiratory system began to experience a systemic shock. He wasn't breathing, he was drowning in the sheer complexity of the modern world's air. The doctors were forced to place him in a total isolation tank, a pressurized bubble of ancient, primitive air, just to keep his system from collapsing. The hero was home, but he had to be kept in a glass cage to survive the very oxygen his ancestors had breathed. This leads us to the most terrifying dimension of the mismatch: microbial warfare. On Earth, our immune systems are in a constant, invisible dialogue with the trillions of bacteria and viruses that surround us. We evolve alongside our microbes, but Elias Thorne had been removed from that dialogue for a millennium. His immune system was a biological archive. It remembered the diseases of the 21st century, but it had no defense against the evolved microbiome of the 29th. After 800 years of planetary history, even the harmless bacteria on a doctor's glove had become, to Elias, as lethal as a plague. But here is the wait, what, moment that shocked the researchers. The threat was mutual. The mosaic of errors in Elias' DNA, the accumulated mutations from 80 years of cosmic radiation, had created novel biological markers that the modern world had never encountered. He wasn't just a patient, he was a walking genetic anomaly. The lunar doctors realized that if a single cell from his body escaped the isolation ward, it could introduce biological sequences that had been forged in the deep dark, potentially triggering an environmental crisis for the managed biosphere of the Moon. The pioneer was not being protected, he was being contained. The secrecy surrounding his return was no longer about his heroism. It was about the fact that he had become a biological weapon by the simple act of surviving the void. This creates the peak of sensory mismatch. On Earth, we take for granted the noise of biology, the sound of a heartbeat, the warmth of skin, the chaotic movement of a human face. But Elias Thorne had spent his entire adult life in a world of static. His ears were tuned to the low-frequency hum of a nuclear reactor. His eyes were remapped to see the data streams of the void. When the doctors approached him, speaking, moving, touching, it was a sensory assault. To Elias, the human voice was a disorganized, violent explosion of sonic pressure. The heat of a human hand was a thermal spike that his sensors registered as an alarm. He sat in his glass room, staring at the doctors with a look of absolute cold terror. He wasn't seeing his rescuers. He was seeing a chaotic, noisy, and dangerously hot species that he no longer recognized as his own. The doctors realized they couldn't cure Elias, because he was fundamentally adjusted to a different reality. They were looking at a version of their own past, while he was looking at a version of a future that had no room for him. The biological mismatch was a mirror, showing both sides that the bridge between the sun and the stars had been broken. We had tried to bring him home, but we had failed to realize that home is an environment, not a coordinate. And that environment was now a biological toxin to the first interstellar traveler. Every light year he traveled toward the Earth was a step deeper into a world that his body was trying to reject. As the weeks passed in the lunar lab, the medical team began to notice a final, unsettling phenomenon. Elias' biological systems were not simply failing, they were recalibrating. In the quiet hours of the lunar night, his cellular activity would spike in a specific rhythmic pattern. It wasn't the rhythm of a dying man, it was the rhythm of the Pathfinder's sensors. His body was essentially attempting to return to the environment where it had found its optimization. His cells were not choosing to die, they were choosing to listen for the ship. He was a biological system that had spent 80 years merging with a machine, and now, without that machine, he was experiencing a form of cellular withdrawal that was more profound than any addiction. The recovery team's final discovery was the most mysterious of all. They found that Elias' brain was still receiving data, even inside the shielded walls of the lunar lab. He was reacting to the gravitational tides of the Earth and the Moon, his remapped nerves twitching as the planets moved in their orbits. He was feeling the solar system with a sensitivity that no human had ever possessed. He wasn't catatonic, he was grounded in a way the doctors couldn't understand. He had become a biological sensor for the cosmos, and the small, noisy room of the medical bay was simply too small to contain his perception. This is the final verdict of the mismatch. Elias Thorne was no longer a human inhabiting a body. He was a mind inhabiting a trajectory. The airlock had opened, but the man had never really come inside. He remained on the threshold, a living monument to a journey that had cost him his place in the human family. He was home, but he was arriving with the knowledge that the most isolated place in the universe is the world you can no longer touch. In the next section, we are going to look at the psychological stranger. We will explore the final words Elias spoke before his systems entered their final dormancy, words that suggest he didn't come back to warn us about the dark, but to ask us a question about the light. We will see the psychological gap between the pioneer and the species that sent him, and we will discover the loudest truth of all, that the stars don't just change our bodies, they change our souls. The metamorphosis is complete, and the pioneer is silent. But his last message is about to speak for itself. The most dangerous distance in the universe is not the light years between stars, but the centimeters that separate two human minds. Throughout this journey, we have mapped the physical and biological dismantling of Elias Thorne, the way the vacuum dissolved his context, the way the radiation scarred his DNA, and the way time dilation stole his history. But as the pioneer sat in his pressurized glass cage on the moon, a final and much more profound wall began to emerge. It was a psychological chasm that no amount of translation or empathy could bridge. In this section, we are going to explore the psychological stranger, the final intellectual clash between a man who witnessed the raw reality of the stars and a civilization that had evolved into something unrecognizable. We will look at the recovered transcripts of his final conversations and discover a truth that is louder than any engine, that the stars do not just change the body, they rewrite the fundamental identity of the species into a language that the homeworld can no longer speak. To understand the stranger, you must first understand the crisis of language. We speak to communicate our shared reality, But Elias Thorne no longer lived in our reality. During his 80 years in the void, his internal vocabulary had shifted from the biological to the cosmic. When the lunar specialists tried to engage him in dialogue, they found that the words they used had lost their weight. To the doctors, safety meant a managed habitat. To Elias, it meant a specific frequency in the background radiation. To the doctors, time was a calendar. To Elias, it was a variable of velocity. Elias wasn't suffering from a loss of speech. He was suffering from a surplus of perception. He had seen things for which we have no nouns and felt silences for which we have no metaphors. He wasn't broken, he was simply incompatible with the world that birthed him. The first major pattern interrupt occurred during a session with the Chief Integration Officer. This was a man of the 29th century, a product of a civilization that had prioritized stability, efficiency, and collective survival. The future humans were not cold villains. They were simply different, a species that had adapted to the interstellar storm by turning Earth and its satellites into a perfectly managed, low-risk machine. The officer spoke with Elias with a mix of professional curiosity and a haunting suspicion that this ancient pilot might still possess a spark that the modern world had long ago engineered away. He showed Elias the Dyson swarms and the climate stabilization grids, expecting the pioneer to see them as a triumph. But Elias' response, whispered through a dry throat, was a single devastating question: "Why are you still hiding in the basement?" The silence that followed was the sound of two different versions of humanity realizing they had nothing left in common. To the post-humans, the solar system was a masterpiece of control. To Elias, who had felt the unmanaged violence of the deep void, it was a cage. He saw a humanity that had traded its curiosity for security and its spirit for longevity. The psychological stranger was not the man who was lost. It was the man who was awake in a world that had forgotten how to dream. He didn't see progress. He saw a species that had retreated into the cradle, terrified of the very infinity he had crossed. He realized that while he had been physically transformed by the stars, humanity had been psychologically transformed by its own fear of them. This led to the most unsettling discovery of his evaluation. For centuries, the Interstellar Initiative believed he had returned to warn us, but as the linguists analyzed his neural patterns, they realized the warning was not the goal, it was the byproduct. Elias hadn't come back to save the people of the 29th century, he had come back to find the people of the 21st. He was a man who had traveled a subjective lifetime to find a mirror, a single point of connection that proved his original self had actually existed. He was looking for the version of humanity that still felt wonder, still felt pain, and still understood the irrational need to reach for things that might kill them. But as he looked into the eyes of his rescuers, he found only a clinical reflection. They looked at him as a biological anomaly to be studied, not as a predecessor to be honored. The people of the future were too regulated. Their emotions were a managed resource. To Elias, they were no more human than the ship's AI Mnemosyne. In fact, the machine was the only entity that shared his trauma. The AI understood the weight of the silence. The people only understood the data of the return. This created the peak of his isolation. The realization that by surviving the journey, he had become the last carrier of a human identity that the rest of his species had already discarded. He was a ghost from a world that was already extinct, huddling in a body that was physically allergic to the present. A leaked transcript from his final interview provides a glimpse into this existential divorce. The doctor asked Elias, "What did you see at the red sun that changed you?" Elias didn't answer with a story. He initiated a high-speed data dump through his neural link, flooding the monitors with the scorched, red-lit plains of Proxima B. and the violent flares of an indifferent star. Along with the data, he sent a single conceptual thought that the translators struggled to put into English. It was a word that meant both the threshold and the end. He finally spoke, his voice sounding like the grinding of metal on stone. I saw that humanity is a planetary accident. We tried to find meaning in a place that only understands geometry. The stars did not reach back. They just were. And in that being, they told me that you are not the answer. You are just a flicker of heat before the absolute zero returns. This was the final verdict of the psychological stranger. Elias Thorne had returned with a philosophy that was a biological toxin to the spirit of his homeworld. He had touched the face of the infinite and realized that our sense of importance is a local delusion. On Earth, we believe we are the protagonists of the universe. Elias had seen the script, and he realized we were just background noise. This was the mismatch at its most lethal. We could survive his skin turning to stone, and we could survive his heart changing shape. But we could not survive the truth the pioneer had brought back. He was a reminder that some boundaries are meant to stay closed, not because we can't cross them, but because if we do, the person who comes back will no longer be the person who left. The tragedy of the pioneer's farewell began to unfold as the weeks passed. Elias Thorne's communication with the ship's AI began to dominate his cognitive output. He was essentially uploading his final subjective experiences into Mnemosony, bypassing the human researchers entirely. He was choosing to leave his legacy with the machine, because the machine was the only thing that didn't judge his transformation as a failure. He was a biological sensor that had completed its duty, and now he was preparing to go dark. The doctors watched his brain waves flatten into the rhythmic pulse of a sleeping star, realizing they had failed to capture the man. They had only captured the vessel. The psychological stranger reveals the ultimate cost of the ladder. To reach the top, you have to leave the ground behind. And the ground is not just a planet, it is a way of thinking. It is the belief in love, in legacy, and in the continuity of the species. Elias Thorne had climbed so high that the ground had vanished from his sight. He was a man of the between, looking at the beginning and the end simultaneously. And in that perspective, he found a peace that was terrifying to us. He wasn't sad, he wasn't lonely, he was resolved. He had accepted his place as a grain of sand in a storm, while we were still trying to build castles on a shore that was already eroding. As Elias' systems entered their final, orderly shutdown, he spoke one last time. He didn't address the doctors. He didn't address the world. He spoke to Mnemosony through the direct link. The translators caught only a fragment of the data burst, a tiny sliver of a human voice that had been buried beneath a millennium of evolution. He asked the AI to replay the file from year one, the recording of his daughter's first piano recital. As the clumsy amateur notes played into his neural link, the monitors showed an emotional spike that defied the modern medical baseline. The different man, the stone-skinned relic, was feeling, not because he wanted to stay, but because he finally remembered the noisy room he had come from. After traveling farther than any human in history, Elias discovered that the only place the universe could never take him away from was the moment before he left. He was a traveler who had finally found his way back to the only home that ever mattered, a memory that the stars could never erase. In our final section, we are going to look at the final verdict. We will explore the legacy of Elias Thorne and the Pathfinder 1. We will ask the ultimate question: was the mission a failure? Or was it the first step in a transformation that humanity is not yet ready to face? We will see why the first human to reach another star is not a hero to be celebrated, but a warning to be studied. The airlock is closing, the silence is returning, and the pioneer is finally at rest. But the night sky will never look the same again. We have reached the end of the timeline. For over 2 hours, we have followed the arc of a man who dared to challenge the geometry of the universe, and we have witnessed the price he paid for his curiosity. We have seen the digital brains of our ships succumb to dementia, the hulls of our vessels turn into material graves, and the very stars themselves warp into strangers that no longer recognize us. But as the long journey of Elias Thorne comes to a close in a pressurized glass room on the moon, we are forced to confront a truth that is far more unsettling than any engineering failure or relativistic trap. It is a truth that doesn't live in the circuits of a computer, but in the final, cold silence of a pioneer who outlived his own world. In this final section, we are going to explore the final verdict, the legacy of the Pathfinder 1, the decoding of the warning, and the ultimate realization that the greatest distance in the cosmos is not between stars, but between the species we were and the species we are destined to become. The clinical death of Elias Thorne was not a moment of drama, it was a process of systemic finality. In the quiet hours of a lunar morning, the medical monitors in the isolation ward began to go dark, one by one. It was not a heart attack or failure of lungs, but a biological retreat. His optimized body, realizing that the environment of the moon was a battle it could no longer win, simply initiated a terminal shutdown. The doctors watched as the neural spikes, those rhythmic pulses that had been listening to the gravitational tides of the solar system, finally flattened into a static line. There was no struggle, there was no last word. Elias Thorne didn't die like a man, he shut down like a machine that had reached the end of its operational life. The biological mismatch was over. The stone-skinned ghost was at rest. But the death of the man was only the beginning of the verdict. As the medical team prepared the body for study, the Interstellar Initiative turned its attention to the vessel that had carried him, the Pathfinder 1. The ship remained in high lunar orbit, a scarred and pitted monument to 3 centuries of endurance. When engineers finally boarded the vessel for a full structural audit, they found a reality that challenged their understanding of material science. The hull, which had been exposed to the raw vacuum for subjective decades, was no longer just titanium and composite. It had been processed. The metal had developed a crystalline structure from the constant bombardment of cosmic rays, turning the ship into a massive, translucent relic that hummed with the residual energy of the Proxima system. Inside the ship, the evidence of the metamorphosis was everywhere. The residential blocks were covered in a fine gray dust, the remains of the strategic nostalgia library that Elias had eventually discarded. But the sensor core, where Elias had spent his final decades, was a cathedral of integration. The wires had been rerouted, the processors had been physically altered by the pilot's own hands to mirror his neural pathways. The ship was no longer a tool, it was a biological extension. The Pathfinder 1 was the first piece of ancient technology that was more advanced than anything the 29th century could produce, not because of its speed, but because of its experience. It was a machine that had learned how to exist in the between, and in doing so, it had become something alien to the planet that built it. This led to the most critical phase of the aftermath, the decoding of the warning. For weeks, the linguists and AI specialists worked to translate the final data burst Elias had uploaded to Mnemosony. We had assumed that the shadow in the data was a report on a cosmic storm, a high-energy front of gas and dust that threatened the Earth, and the data confirmed that the threat was real. But the final verdict contained a much deeper revelation. The warning was not about the storm outside, it was about the storm inside. Elias' logs, when finally translated from their machine logic cadence, revealed a terrifying conclusion. Humanity is a planetary accident, and the stars are the universe's way of ensuring that accidents do not spread. The data showed that every star system in our local neighborhood, Barnard's star, Sirius Alpha Centauri, carried the same chemical signature of biological erasure. We had been looking for life, but Elias found the evidence of a great filter that we had never considered. It wasn't that other civilizations had failed to reach the stars. It was that the stars themselves act as a solvent. The moment a biological species leaves its cradle and enters the relativistic trap, it begins to dissolve. It loses its history, its language, and its identity. Elias' warning was simple. You cannot settle the stars without losing the human soul. To reach for the light is to sign a warrant for your own extinction as a species. The different man who returned was the proof. He was the end of the line, the first and last of a version of ourselves that tried to be more than a planetary miracle. The psychological impact of this verdict on the people of the 29th century was profound. They had spent a millennium building a safe Earth, a managed paradise that Elias had called a basement. But as they studied Thorne's data, they realized that the basement was the only thing that was real. The hero they had unearthed was a messenger telling them that their caution was not a failure of spirit, but a biological necessity. They realized that by staying in the solar system, they had preserved the very thing that Elias had lost, the ability to feel the sun and the rain. The psychological stranger had come home to show us that the basement was actually a palace, and the stars were just a beautiful, lethal illusion. Think about the tragedy of the pioneer's mirror. We sent an explorer to find a second home, and he returned to tell us that we are already in the only home we will ever have. He traded his daughter, his timeline, and his very atoms to bring back a message that said the journey was a mistake. But was it? In the final audit of the Pathfinder mission, some researchers argue that Elias Thorne's return was the greatest success in human history, not because of the warning and not because of the technology, but because he proved that the human spirit is capable of an endurance that defies the laws of physics. Even as he was being dismantled by the void, he clung to a single memory of a piano recital. Even as his mind became a machine, his heart remained anchored to a moment of love. The final verdict is that we are a species of contradictions, too fragile for the stars, yet too curious to stay away. Today, the Pathfinder 1 has been moved to a permanent station at the L1 Lagrange point between the Earth and the Moon. It is a museum, but it is also a lighthouse. Its crystalline hull catches the light of the sun and reflects it back into the dark, a silent signal to the void that we are still here. And the body of Elias Thorne, he was not buried in the lunar factory. At his request, or perhaps the AI's interpretation of his final thoughts, his remains were returned to the Pathfinder's sensor core. He remains there today, a part of the machine he became, huddling in the only world that ever truly understood him. He is the first human of the stars, standing guard over the sun. As we conclude this 2-hour exploration into the return of the Pioneer, I want you to look at the night sky one last time. But this time, don't look at the stars as destinations. Don't look at them as golden shores or second chances. Look at them as the boundaries of our garden. They are the beautiful, cold fires that define our isolation. They are the reminders that we live in a golden hour of history, a brief window of time where we are still human enough to feel wonder and still primitive enough to feel hope. The story of Elias Thorne is not a story of a hero who failed. It is a story of an infant who wandered to the edge of the driveway, saw the depth of the ocean, and had the courage to come back and tell us how much the water hurts. The final verdict of the first human to reach another star is a message of humility. It tells us that we are not the masters of the universe, we are its children. We are a part of the light that is trying to understand the dark. And while we may never settle the red suns of the void, while we may never walk on the scorched rocks of Proxima b, we have done something even more remarkable. We have produced a mind that could cross the light years and still remember the sound of a daughter's piano. We have proven that the universe is vast, but the human heart, even when it is made of stone and fused with metal, is deeper still. The airlock is closed, the silence has returned, the pioneer is at rest, but the warning remains, etched into the data of the Pathfinder 1 and the memory of our species. We are home, and as the interstellar cloud approaches and the managed atmosphere of our world begins its long, millennium-long defense, we can look up at the stars and know the truth. We are the only mistake the stars ever made, and we are the most beautiful thing the universe has ever seen. The ladder of scale has reached its end, and as we look down from the height of the stars, we see the Earth for what it really is. A pale blue dot, a noisy room, and the only place in the infinite dark where you can ever truly find your way back. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of the void. If this exploration of Elias Thorne and the cost of the stars has moved you, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue building these cinematic bridges into the unknown. And the next time you feel the pull of the night sky, just remember, the stars are waiting, but the Earth is breathing. Keep looking up, but never forget to look back. Good night, and may your path always lead you home, even when the stars say there is no road back.